We'll discuss the basic neuroanatomy in MRI brain. Before that, let us define some terminology for reference. When we say coronal view, it's just like looking on a front view. Axial view is cross-section, and sagittal view is equivalent to side view. This is a sagittal view of a brain MRI. For orientation, this is the anterior aspect and this is the posterior aspect. Before we proceed on the structures in the brain, let us identify some other structures that can be seen here. This is the tongue. Above that will be the nasopharyngeal space. Superior to nasopharynx is the sphenoid sinus. Before the skull, we have the subcutaneous fat. The frontal bone is demonstrated in this cut. The clivus is a bony part of the cranium at the skull base. It is the sloping midline surface of the skull base anterior to the foramen magnum and posterior to the dorsum sellae. Now, one of the important landmarks that divides supratentorial from infratentorial structure is the tentorium cerebelli. The supratentorial structures include the two cerebral hemispheres and its subcortical nuclei and white matter fibers. The infratentorial structures include those in the posterior fossa, such as the cerebellum and the brainstem. In this image, the prominent structure in the middle is the corpus callosum, which is the largest commissural fiber in the brain. Commissural fibers connect left and right hemispheres. It has four parts. Starting from anterior, we have the rostrum, genu, body, and splenium posteriorly. From the rostrum to the body of corpus callosum, it is supplied by branches coming from the anterior cerebral artery. The splenium, on the other hand, is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Just above the corpus callosum is the callosal sulcus. Above it is the cingulate gyrus, which is part of the limbic system involved in processing emotions and behavior regulation. It also helps to regulate autonomic motor function. Right after the cingulate gyrus is the cingulate sulcus. Above the cingulate sulcus, you can appreciate three cerebral lobes here: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is separated from the frontal lobe by the central sulcus of Rolando, while the parieto-occipital sulcus separates parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Below the corpus callosum is the fornix. Fornix is a part of the limbic system. It is the major output tract of the hippocampus. Inferior to that is the thalamus, which relays motor and sensory signals to the cerebral cortex. Inferior to the thalamus is the brainstem composed of midbrain, pons, and medulla. Posterior to the brainstem is the cerebellum. In this sagittal view, I'll be demonstrating the CSF flow. CSF is produced by the choroid plexus located at the lateral ventricles. It will flow to the third ventricle via the foramen of Monro, then to the cerebral aqueduct, or also called as aqueduct of Sylvius, or iter. It is the ventricle of the midbrain. After which, CSF will flow to the fourth ventricle in the pons and the medulla. It is the ventricle of the cerebellum as well. The CSF will flow out from the ventricles to the subarachnoid space via three foramina: two foramen of Luschka laterally and one foramen of Magendie medially. In the subarachnoid space, there are prominent spaces called cisterns. Cisterns are spaces within the subarachnoid space where the pia mater and arachnoid membrane are not in close approximation. In front of the midbrain, there is the interpeduncular cistern. Posteriorly, there is the quadrigeminal cistern, which is posterior to the quadrigeminal plate. In front of the pons is the prepontine cistern. And the largest of all cistern is the cisterna magna. The cisterna magna is located between the cerebellum and the dorsal surface of the medulla, which is above the level of the foramen magnum. Let's go back to the structures near the thalamus. Inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The pituitary stalk connects the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The optic chiasm lies approximately 1 cm above the pituitary fossa. The chiasm contains decussating axons from both optic nerves. Now let's go down to the structures around the midbrain. In front of the midbrain is the mammillary bodies. The primary function of mammillary bodies is recollective memory. It also functions to assist with emotion and reward behaviors and goal-directed behaviors. Posterior to the cerebral aqueduct, you can appreciate the tectum, or also called as quadrigeminal plate. It is called quadrigeminal plate because it is composed of 4 colliculi, a pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi. Superior to the quadrigeminal plate is the pineal gland. Pineal gland apparently produces melatonin that regulates sleep. Now let us see the axial view of the brain in MRI. One very important landmark is the central sulcus that delineates frontal lobe anteriorly and parietal lobe posteriorly. But how do we identify among these several sulci here is the central sulcus? Number 1. Look for the sigmoid or hook sign. It is also called as the inverted omega sign. It is actually the posterior surface of the precentral gyrus. Once you identify this area, the sulcus after which is the central sulcus. Number 2. You can observe that the postcentral gyrus is actually thinner than the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe that functions as the primary motor cortex, whereas the postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe that functions as the primary sensory cortex. The third sign is the T sign. The T sign is produced when the posterior end of the superior frontal sulcus joins the precentral sulcus and forms like an inverted T. Once you identify the precentral gyrus, then you may be able to identify the central sulcus. This cut demonstrates the lateral ventricle. This is the third ventricle. This is an axial cut at the level of the subcortical nuclei. Nucleus is a collection of neuronal cell bodies found in the central nervous system. The caudate nucleus is the lateral border of the lateral ventricle. Lateral to the third ventricle is the thalamus. The lentiform nucleus is composed of the globus pallidus medially and the putamen laterally. The internal capsule is sandwiched among the subcortical nuclei. The anterior limb is between the caudate and the lentiform nucleus, while the posterior limb is between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus. This is at the level of the midbrain. The midbrain looks like an inverted shorts. The substantia nigra delineates tegmentum from the cerebral peduncle. Cerebral peduncle serves as a conduit of different projection fibers, and one of them is the corticospinal tract. At the tegmentum, you may see the red nucleus, which is involved in motor coordination. In front of the midbrain is the 2 mammillary bodies. Lateral to the midbrain is the middle aspect of the temporal lobe, which is the hippocampus. This is at the level of the pons. The fourth ventricle is the ventricle of the pons, and posterior to the pons is the cerebellum. The basilar artery is situated anterior to the pons and is lodged at a groove in the middle of the pons. The middle cerebellar peduncle connects pons to the cerebellum. This is cranial nerve 7 and cranial nerve 8 at the cerebellopontine angle. This is the medulla. Anterior part of the medulla is called pyramids, where corticospinal tract passes through. Anteriorly, you may see the 2 vertebral artery. The tonsils are the lowest part of the cerebellum. The tonsils of the cerebellum is situated in inferior medial surface of each cerebellar hemisphere. Tonsillar herniation is often called coning. If it herniates through the foramen magnum, it causes compression of the medulla, leading to respiratory arrest and may be typically rapidly fatal. Compression of the fourth ventricle may also result into obstructive hydrocephalus. This is a MRA that shows the intracranial vessels. The anterior circulation starts from the internal carotid artery. And let's trace the right ICA, which divides into a medial cerebral artery supplying the lateral brain and the anterior cerebral artery or ACA supplying the medial aspect of the brain. On the other hand, the posterior circulation starts with the two vertebral artery. They join at the level of the pontomedullary junction and forms the big basilar artery. The basilar artery bifurcates as the posterior cerebral artery at the level of the pontomesencephalic junction. The cerebellum receives blood supply from the following: posterior inferior cerebellar artery or pica, which is a branch of the vertebral artery; anterior inferior cerebellar artery or ICA, which is a branch of the basilar artery. Superior cerebellar artery is a branch of basilar artery as well.